Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight and we're excited to host tonight's event with Salar Abdoh and Dalia Sofer presenting their new books, Out of Mesopotamia and Man of My Time. They will be talking with Persis Karim, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Salar, Dalia, and Persis and the teams at Akashic and FSG for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, there's just a couple of housekeeping things to go over before we get started. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. So the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the authors, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two little speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured books, Out of Mesopotamia and Man of My Time, are available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, and you can purchase Salar and Dalia's books and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for this evening is Persis Karim. She is a poet, editor, and professor of Comparative and World Literature at San Francisco University, where she also serves as the Neda Nobari Chair and Director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. Her poetry has been published in numerous publications, including Read Magazine, Callaloo, and the New York Times, Teshera, and others. She's the editor of 3 anthologies of Iranian diaspora literature, including Tremors, new fiction by Iranian-American writers. She'll be speaking with our featured authors, Salar Abdoh and Dalia Sofer. Salar Abdoh was born in Iran and splits his time between Tehran and New York City. He is the author of the novels Tehran at Twilight, The Poet Game, and Opium, and he is the editor of Tehran Noir. He teaches in the MFA program at the City College of New York. His new book, Out of Mesopotamia, follows Saleh, a middle-aged Iranian journalist who cannot keep himself away from the front lines in neighboring Iraq and Syria. Abdoh subverts and expands our understanding of the war novel, offering a meditation on war that is moving, humane, darkly funny, and resonantly true. Dalia Sofer is the author of the national bestseller, The September of Shiraz, which won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, was longlisted for the Orange Prize, and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. It was published in 16 countries. Sofer has received a Whiting Writers Award. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The Believer, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. Born in Tehran, Iran, she lives in New York City. Her new book, Man of My Time, tells the story of Hamid Mozaffarian, an interrogator with the Iranian regime who is forced to reckon with his past when he encounters his estranged family in New York. Politically complex and emotionally compelling, this novel is not only about family and memory, but about the interdependence of captor and captive, of citizen and country, of an individual and his or her heritage. Dalia and Salar are going to start us off with a reading from their books, and then they'll be talking with Persis and with all of you. Please take it away, Dalia.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to read a little bit from Man of My Time. As it was said, it's the story of Hamid Mozaffarian, who is a man who starts out in life as a kind of solitary boy, and he later, he's alienated from his family. He later becomes a revolutionary. He severs with his family. The family moves to New York. He stays in Iran, and he becomes more and more deeply entrenched in the new government. He becomes an interrogator, and later he is in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So when we meet him, he is in New York at the United Nations General Assembly, and he has been asked by his estranged family to carry his father's ashes back to Tehran. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from when he meets up with his brother, Omid. As I waited for Omid on the corner of 43rd Street and First Avenue, I half expected to greet the little brother I had seen for the last time under the fluorescent lights of Mehrabad Airport, looking queasy and far younger than his 16 years. When he approached, I shuddered, not because he still resembled that boy, but because he seemed the replica of my father as I had last seen him, a man in middle age, handsome still but with a paunch, tall and inwardly cracked like a Greek column, a memorial to some realm of expired grandeur. I could tell from his searching eyes that he didn't immediately recognize me, which did not surprise me. Omid, I called out over the chaos of Midtown Manhattan at noon. Omid, Omid. Saying his name over and over soothed me, like a refrain suddenly recalled. When he saw me, he froze for an instant, then his face opened up. He walked toward me with restraint. We stood facing each other, awkward, while journalists and cameramen bypassed us from all directions, visibly annoyed by our moment of inaction amid so much frenzy. We reached for each other, and if I were a religious man, I would have said that this was the closest I had ever come to experiencing God. There was a feeling of utter timelessness, a sense that nothing that had come before and nothing that would come after mattered, only this. And I'll skip ahead and read a little bit from their conversation. For a long time, we sat in silence, our half-eaten sandwiches on our laps, like two awkward boys in a schoolyard at lunch hour. I worried that a photographer might take our picture for an amusing sidebar to the day's hard news. Look, even the Islamic Republic breeds humans. It would be the kind of articles Americans love, affirming their self-proclaimed ability to see humanity even in their enemy, and in so doing, reassuring themselves of their own magnanimous heart. What happened to you, he finally said. I don't know, I said. I meant well, I believe. Did you? In the beginning, yes, I said. And later it became something else. I looked up at the September sky. The clean fall day reminded me of Tehran before the pollution. We all do what we need to do at any given moment, Omid said. Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, he went on, quoting the old proverb, to understand all is to forgive all. His clemency had surfaced so quickly that I doubted its sincerity. I imagined it was an aphorism he had adopted to defend against the sorrows the world had inflicted on him. He looked at his watch and withdrew a mint candy box from his pocket. Here are Baba's ashes, he said. That's all of Baba. I was expecting some kind of pewter urn. Kharnashra, don't be an ass, he said. You want to carry a 10-kilo urn of bone and ash back to Tehran? Of course, it's not all of them. So where is the rest, I said, the familiar outrage surging again. A dead body must remain intact, I continued with the authority of a holy man. You committed a sin, taking the poor man apart like that. The poor man, he said. Where were you all these years, you asshole, when the poor man was alive? His voice was losing its practiced restraint. It never failed. Push anyone hard enough and you arrive at the essence. I stared into my brother's black eyes, mirror images of my own, and said, what happened to understanding all and forgiving all? And I'll skip ahead to the very end of their conversation. Omid, I said, come back to Tehran. It's a different place now. So much is happening, pushing in all directions. It may be ugly and wild, but it's alive. And in its wildness, it reminds you that you are alive too. You, all of you who left and never returned, are frozen in time. You have one final memory and you keep playing and replaying it. And you have already bred a new generation with no memory of their beginnings, except for the occasional kebab they eat with their relatives in some restaurant in New York or Los Angeles, and old pop icons record playing in memoriam. What's holding you here? Nothing, he said, but time. Too much time has passed. It's like a caesura in a poem. Once you have that break in the line, you can't go back. When did you become a poet, I said. We parted with a promise to make up for lost time, starting with lunch the following day. As he exited the UN gate, he held up his hand in a Vulcan salute, as he used to do when we were boys, then dissolved into the crowd on First Avenue. I held the cold tin box in my palm, my father.
That's just gorgeous. That is really, really good writing. Of course, I've read the whole book. Out of Mesopotamia is the story of this journalist, Iranian journalist, who does a lot of things, but he also covers the war, the recent ISIS war in Syria and Iraq. But he sort of gets sucked into it, and he's no longer just a bystander reporting. He becomes a part of it. And in the very brief section I chose to read for you is it will convey a sense of what these landscapes really look like and feel like for the combatants, even if there's not any fighting. And he's just sort of thinking about all that has happened and where they're heading. It's somewhere up in the Nineveh province in north of Iraq. And the only other thing you need to know, there's a word, Arabic word, mokeb. Mokeb is a place where people go to rest, have food, things like that. So you will hear that word in here. Other than that, I'll just read from it. The countryside was a flat nothingness. Occasionally, on parallel dirt roads, a dot moved and we didn't know if the thing was ours or not. Nothing was taken for granted in victory because victory had been here before and it always managed to slip away like fish or happiness. We drove in 3 trucks, hardened men who breathed retribution and the diesel stench of war and loved it. I sat in front next to the cleric, taking in the murderous smoke of cigarettes that only he and I seemed not to care for. The vehicles putrid with a staleness that is indescribable. If I survived, I would live out my life remembering hours such as this when breathing seemed pointless. My eyes tried and failed to catch the distances where a drone, a plane, a gunship, an enemy suicide truck, a friendly, or really any motherfucker at all who could spook you out of your melancholy might suddenly emerge. But my eyes were lemons, God-given failures that mostly just guessed at the things men spoke of when they pointed into distances and felt for the placement of their weapons. Names, everywhere there were names. So many combatants and hangers-on and lost souls treading the dying misfortune of Mesopotamia, that one got lost in the maze of titles and martyrs and those waiting in line. I had developed a fear of returning to the places where war was at a respite or non-existent. Though dangerous, Tel Abdoh was still a few kilometers too far away from the action. I would rather go back to our mokeb and wait for the enemy to strike again. It would have been suicide on their part to hit us once more, but suicide was their stuff of life. And somehow I held the unreasonable faith that if only I stayed at the mokeb long enough, all the dead would return as if they were ghosts on a catwalk. Thank you.
No. Can you hear her? We can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oh no.
Let's see.
Because I think they expose things that are so frequently overlooked in our media representations, and they deal with a lot of complex feeling on the part of the protagonist, but in terms of the sort of contemporariness of Iranian politics and also Iran's regional standing. And I'm particularly interested in Salar, the title of your book, Out of Mesopotamia, because of course that evokes this idea of both the history of a region that is far bigger than just one country. And in some ways, the war of which you write is really a much bigger conflict than any one country. And also it's a battle for something much larger. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea of Mesopotamia as it's figured in your novel.
Yes. Sorry. I apologize. My phone rang. It's crazy. I forgot to turn it off. I'm really embarrassed.
It's okay. It's the middle of the night or something, right?
I'm just going to turn the bloody thing off. Your question entails several things that were on my mind when I wrote this novel. And I feel like, listening to Dalia and having read her book, I feel like we both reached the same place through very different vehicles and experiences. One of the things I wanted to do was to go beyond this notion of, I am an Iranian, but I'm also a Middle Easterner, and I'm comfortable in the greater Middle East, which also includes North Africa and many other places. And the wars that were taking place in Syria and Iraq in the region, even though they were not in Iran proper, they affected me in a very deep way because they were very, very close to home, even though many people that I knew in my milieu just didn't pay it any attention. So I wanted to, and also I'd been working in the region, doing some journalism work and seeing the interconnectedness of all of these things and Iran's place in it, vis-a-vis, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and all of these places. So I wanted to work on a novel that transcended just Iran, but also included it. And when I was in, these places, and of course, Dalia has an Iraqi background as well. So I think she understands what I'm talking about. This landscape where these wars have been taking place is just pregnant with history. It doesn't go away. And it's for the hero who was in the story, the main character, the notion of out of Mesopotamia is basically that you're a part of this landscape, and at the same time, you're always thinking about getting the hell out of it because there's so much trouble all the time. I mean, when I've been there, I've dealt with many refugees, going every which way after certain battles or in camps, going to Turkey, going to Greece. Everybody wants to get out. Everybody somehow wants to get out, whereas my protagonist wants to get in, but he's not alone in that. There are particular kinds of men who really are drawn to this notion of combat, and also for the Iranians that came there, it was also a notion of protecting the holy places, which they really were, like they really meant it. It was a real thing. It wasn't a made out. It was not manufactured by any government. So, but at the same time, the brutality of war and its aftermath has in the back of your mind the idea of getting out. But for the main character, who's a very well-read person, he's always thinking of Mesopotamia as also a place that was the cradle of civilization. It gave the world so many things. The great library in the places that they fought in this last war from 3,000 years ago. So, Out of Mesopotamia is just is the title that entails a lot of things about what there is there, what there has been there, what people aspire to by wanting to get out of there, and what the reality of that place is.
Thank you. That's great. It's a very compelling title because it does kind of move beyond a sort of geographicness, and also it plays to the idea of how history haunts us. And for that, I want to turn to you, Dalia, and talk a little bit about Hamid, the protagonist of your novel, and in some ways how he's haunted by history, both a national history, but also a familial history. And if you could talk a little bit about, I think there was a phrase, and I don't remember where it is, but the idea of being trapped by history. And if you could talk a little bit about the notion about what drives your novel and the character in it, in terms of both trying to transcend that history and yet finding himself over and over again in that cycle.
Yeah, I mean, Hamid, as you said, is a product of his personal history, his family history, and history at large with a capital H. But, and therefore, you know, hence the title of the book, Man of My Time. He's a man of his time. He's what his time has made of him. But at the same time, he's an actor in that history. So all of his actions have ripple effects on his own life and the lives of everyone around him and the lives of future generations, including his daughter. So as the book progresses, he comes to understand that there is no such thing as a solitary act in family or in history, that every action of one individual is really having a ripple effect on everybody else and throughout time. And, you know, for me, through the book is really his quest for self-knowledge. You know, he's an interrogator, but he's really a self-interrogator in truth. And it's through that self-knowledge that he actually achieves at the end, that he finally sees that what he needs to do is to act in deference to the future. So in the end, he actually doesn't act in deference to the future, which is really on behalf of his daughter and her generation. And that gives him a certain kind of quietude, if not peace.
I'm sorry, I froze again. I'm going to another room. I'm freezing. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. It's interesting because both of your novels involve interrogation, both self-interrogation and the act of, you know, one interrogating the others on the part of an ideological, you know, state position. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see these novels in some ways interrogating something about the state, either the state like the Iranian state, or more importantly, the kind of state violence and state ideology that is being promulgated through the act of interrogation and fear, and perhaps the idea of how we're complicit in our own demise, or our own you know, participation in acts of history that sometimes we're not fully conscious of. I don't know if that was a very clear question, but I'll see what you say. So interrogation as a mode of both questioning and extracting cooperation and complicity, both on the part of an individual, but also others.
Yeah, I mean, interrogation is a way to control others. And in, you know, in its most obvious way, that's what the interrogator is doing. But, you know, for me, what I was more interested in, more than the mechanics of, you know, the Islamic Republic and their systems and so on, what I was really interested in is the psyche of an individual who is sort of getting himself involved in that system. So as opposed to the exterior effects of that, which we do see, I was more interested in remaining in that psyche and in remaining, you know, in following the dissolution of that psyche and what happens to him. And in fact, in the book, what I tried to do was to not depict any real interrogation scenes. There are some kind of semi ones, and there is a non-interrogation scene where Hamid kind of says, well, I could have written about this or that, but I won't. Or I could have said this, you know, because I feel like we've had a lot of narratives like that. And, you know, so I wanted to stay away from those depictions, those very sort of, let's explore the brutality. I wanted to stay away from that and just stay with the psychological aspect of it.
Salar, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. There's a great passage in Dalia's book that I never forget. There were many passages in that book that I cannot forget, but one, that the main character is thinking, he says, you know, anybody whose shirt sleeve brushed against Evan Prison had to go ahead and write a memoir about their incarceration, whether it was 2 days or 2 years. That comes from somewhere. I could follow the thought processes of my fellow writer when she put that in the mind of this character. And I arrived at similar, in a similar place from another conduit. Obviously, a lot of my experiences are kind of firsthand. I've been in those landscapes and spaces. I have an interrogator too, but you know, he's a guy who starts reading Marcel Proust and then really gets into it. And it's true. You can actually have an interrogator. It happens all the time in Iran, where you start, you know, they might be talking to you about why did you write something, and within a few minutes, you're actually having a literary discussion. And so that came from somewhere. It didn't come from a vacuum. And what I was interested in, I think like Dalia, is to sort of convey, to get beyond this one-dimensional depiction of places like Iran, where, you know, they depict this sort of monolithic entity which is dark and evil. And because Iran is not like that, no place on earth is like that. It's a very complicated place where bad things happen and also good things happen. And a person such as an interrogator can be full of nuances. And the perfect example of that is Hamid in Dalia's book. He's the main character. My interrogator is a side character, so I don't delve too deeply into him. But I think we both wanted to, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we both wanted to show the nuances of these societies, this society, even through characters who may not necessarily on the surface be, you know, people that you would want to, you know, go to lunch with, although I would. And I do.
Yeah. Your interrogator would be good, you know, as a lunch date too. You know, he's reading.
You could talk about Marcel Proust.
That's right. Both of your novels involve two important themes that I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about. One is the notion of sacrifice, and the other notion is about art and how art is sort of posited against this larger narrative about brutality, violence, war, revolution, and, you know, and a kind of ideology. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I think, you know, one of the interesting things is both of you have a I don't know if what you call it, a trope, a symbol. Dalia, yours is Hamid's father's ashes travel with him everywhere. And then in your novel, Salar, it's the Marcel Proust, sorry, forgot the title, even though it's about forgetting. And both of those in some ways are representative of the passage of time and the role of art, because Hamid's father is, I forget what his position is. He's
for a while he's an art historian. He's a
art historian
in the Ministry of Culture.
I thought it was really fascinating that both of your novels engage this theme of art and how it kind of is posited against this larger framing of brutality, ideology, violence, you know, these big grand narratives of history. And then there's this idea of art. And your protagonist, Salar, is a writer, and he gets asked to write art reviews and a film script. And against that is these kind of larger themes of brutality and the specter of violence, if not violence directly. I wonder what you want to convey with those two, you know, those two oppositions, because of course there's also the idea of how art functions in a kind of more commercial way, and the value of art for a society.
Yeah, great question. I mean, once again, these things came out of my own experiences, because during the half decade where I was coming and going to the war, I was also doing other things in Iran, such as writing art catalogs for artists. I was writing film scripts, and I was, you know, there's a milieu in Tehran certainly where it's a very art conscious city. I would argue there are more art galleries in Tehran than New York even, or cafes, and that's not good or bad, but it creates a certain thing, reality, which I was interested in, because I was thinking about two things, you know. One was that, you know, you can be, I don't know, you can be in this town of BG and by BG in middle of Iraq, in the trenches, and then take one of the convoys back to Baghdad, fly to Iran, and go have a cappuccino on Karim Khan Avenue with your friends, and maybe go catch a art gallery opening if it's a Friday. And your friends don't know a bloody thing about any of these things, and they're not really interested in it. And if they are interested in it, it's only to make fun of these guys who are volunteering to go there and fight. And meanwhile, you know, they don't realize that, you know, this is happening a few hundred kilometers. You know, I mean, I'm talking about the distance that's less than San Francisco to Los Angeles. And this kind of blew my mind, this obliviousness, you know, when I would take the flight from Baghdad or Erbil and come to New York and go teach my classes, you know, that's almost going to another planet. But, you know, Iran, Tehran, and then Baghdad are, as the crow flies, only a few hundred miles. And I was really interested in these juxtapositions and the fact that I was in all of these worlds, in the worlds of combat and art. I mean, deep in my neck into the world of art and film, cinema, my friends, and how that reality plays itself out. But also like what art can do for you, like such as what great texts such as Marcel Proust, where they can take you and where fraudulence can take you, because my character, main protagonist, also faces these people who write, you know, peace poems to get invited to festivals in Europe. So he's faced with very, very real, authentic things that he wants to be a part of, but the very stuff of life that he is made of, the very world he inhabits, and he talks about it, is one where the art world sort of is not authentic. And he talks about having to cover art shows in Dubai and this and that. He sees himself as a cog in the wheel of a greater thing. He tries to break out of it by seeing the war as something fresh that he can be engaged in with men who, you know, who make the ultimate sacrifice, is to go, they sell everything. And I've seen men like that, you know, they'll sell the shirt off their back. They will literally crawl their way to be in a battlefield. And no, the Iranian regime did not put them on bus loads like some of the newspapers here say and take them to the front. They actually tried to prevent them from going because they were not part of the Revolutionary Guards. So I've seen these men like go to inordinate lengths to do this stuff, and I ask myself, why? Why this sacrifice? Why? And I know why. It took me a while to figure it out, because I thought one of the things they were trying to recapture that sense of oneness and brotherhood that the beginning of the revolution, the generation before them had, and they have read in books of the martyrs and the great commanders of the Iran-Iraq war, and their speech in the trenches and outside of the trenches was also that kind of speech. It was all about martyrdom and sacrifice and the greater thing. So it was very interesting, and I've talked before about it in other places, that it wasn't all, even that wasn't all authentic, because, you know, there is also one-up showmanship and bluster about martyrdom. And sometimes when people talk about it, they don't really mean it. Some people mean it, some people don't mean it. And also we live in an age of social media, so that, you know, these people are doing all these things and talking about all these things, but also they're posting it. In Iraq, it was, you know, in Iran is big on Instagram, Iraq is big on Facebook. I don't know why. But so like all of this stuff was also happening. And, you know, it really gives you a lot to pause about and think about.
Dalia, can you speak a little bit about the notion of sacrifice in your novel? Because I think it's also an important theme.
Well, I don't know that I see Hamid really sacrificing anything until the very end. I mean, I think he compromises a lot, but he's somebody who is getting into situations because of decisions he's made. So he betrays his father, and then he gets drawn into something, and he kind of gets drawn into the system that envelops him. So I don't know, I mean, he does come to the revolution from a somewhat idealistic place, but I don't know that he's making those kind of conscious sacrifices until the very end, when he finally reconnects with his daughter, and he understands that the only thing he can do is to act in a way, as I said before, sort of in regard to the future. So he reveals something, and he knows that this is going to cost him his rekindled relationship with his daughter, but he does it nonetheless, you know, because he feels like it's the one right thing he's going to do in his life. Yeah. In terms of art, I mean, I think art books kind of echo the idea of art, and art, of course, is a vehicle for understanding the world and processing it. And for Hamid, who starts to draw from a very young age, it's a way to process his alienation and his grief sometimes. And it's his way to connect with the outside world in a way that he can't emotionally. He's just not equipped to do it. I was also interested in art as satire, the ability of satire to observe society and comment on it and comment on corruption. And so I was playing with that in the book, and I was hoping or trying that the book itself would serve in that way a little bit, because in this book, though I was interested in the pain of certain situations, I was also interested in the absurdity of situations. So satire played an important part. And of course, art, you know, as Salar was suggesting too, can also be misused. So states can use art as propaganda. So, you know, murals and all those controlled messages that go out, or they can use it to convey a national image. And also art can be misused for commercial purposes. And I was playing with that idea too through the book in the book. You know, there's somebody who writes a book and he gets all kinds of accolades, but then there's a question of what is that industry of, you know, praise and so on for a particular topic, which itself becomes kind of corrupted, even if it's a worthy topic, but it can be, you know, misused for commercial reasons. So I was also just exploring all these questions.
Yeah, I think both of your novels speak to the idea of absurdity and can you hear me? Are you able to hear me? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Sorry, I froze visually. The idea of the absurdity of operating inside these systems. And in a way, I would say that Western readers and American readers are getting a good dose of that now in their own reality in the United States. So it's not over there anymore, that we're experiencing that kind of like absolute absurdity of how we traffic in certain ideas and notions. And it's, you know, it's not just, I think that's the association that people make with places that are considered corrupt or abusive. So in some ways, I feel like your novel is both of your novels are really refreshing in that they speak to this time that we're living through in the United States as well. Can you, before we open it up for questions, and I want to invite people to pretty soon post your questions, I wonder if you could both talk a little bit, Salar, you talked a little bit about where some of the material for your novels come from, but I don't think people understand the investment that you made in participating in, you know, being in these places, because it's pretty dramatic stuff. And then Dalia, if you could just briefly speak, because I found your novel so rich, and I was like, how did she write this? Because there's a lot of material about being inside the Islamic Republic, being in the head of somebody. So I wonder if you both could talk a little bit about the research that you did briefly before we open it up for questions. And you can post a question if you have one. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dalia.
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of research, I read a lot about the progression of the revolution, because you know, my perception of it was starting to change. So I felt like the predominant narrative of it, which, you know, that it was this kind of movement that was largely brought on by the left and hijacked at the last minute by the clerics, was very simplistic. And so I started to read a lot about that, and to see that that binary understanding of secular versus religious didn't really capture the full complexity, and that religion itself was viewed by many as a very viable vehicle towards social justice, not only by those who were religious. So I read a lot of, you know, around that topic. I also found a manual that Iranian activists had put together for people who end up being detainees, and sort of informing them of what are the tricks of interrogators and how can one sort of resist them. So there are all these, tricks of the trade, and, like things like keeping the detainee in an uncertain situation as long as possible, or good interrogator, bad interrogator, like all these things were discussed in that manual. But in terms of just how and why I wanted and was able to stay in this man's head, some tips, I got a lot of tips from Salar, to be honest, in terms of, how things work within the country. So he was also a source. But in terms of how and why I wanted to stay in the head of this person, that's just a fascination that I have. And I think that I live partly in two places and in two time zones. So I'm constantly living parallel lives, and I'm living in the present and the conditional, and, in the now and the what if. And that's just, I listen to Tehran radio sometimes while I get ready in the morning, and I'm hearing the traffic in Tehran while I'm getting dressed, which makes no sense whatsoever. It's just this kind of schism that I have, and that's how it is.
Salar, can you talk a little bit about tell people a little bit about the time frame of some of your research on, being on in these specific landscapes as you used?
Sure. I'd always been working with, I had a circle of friends in the region who are war photographers or documentarians, and a lot of vets that I know from the Iran-Iraq war. So it was kind of like always percolated in my head, and I've been interested in it. But specifically what happened was that when in 2014, I think, when the war came with a vengeance, spilled out from Syria into Iraq, into northern Iraq, and very quickly started to move south. I had a partner who was a war documentarian, and I just kind of grabbed him and I said, "We're there, we're going." And we did. And we went to the south. It was a very, very difficult situation. There were pockets of enemy combatants everywhere, like very, very far to the south in places. And Baghdad was in danger of being overrun. All of that stuff. So that's when it started. There were refugees from the north all over the place. It was a really, really bad situation. And then I just from there, I ended up working on a project with Sebastian Junger and for the National Geographic that sort of covered the war from all of its aspects that came out. On National Geographic, but even after that, I just sort of remained. I was in three places: United States, New York, Tehran, and also all over Iraq, literally all over. But my main thrust of it was once ISIS was pushed out of Samarra and out of, from BG on, it was a hard-fought battle around Mosul and Tel Afar, and those are the landscapes I really treat in the novel, where the novel takes place between when the Saleh, I didn't really bother to change the name too much, goes home to Tehran and also comes back to the front. That those that's the northern province of Iraq, where the war takes place. And I was there until, they got pushed out of Tel Afar and all of that. And it was just the absurdity that Dalia talks about is also was very much on my mind. Honestly, first of all, I didn't start out wanting to write a novel. I wanted to write a nonfiction, but it was the reality of my own life during that half decade was so bizarre in these different worlds. I just could not put it into nonfiction. And then in fiction, I wanted to write a really serious, full of gravitas war novel, full of, the sorrow of war. And there is that, I think, but there's also all of the absurdities of combat, of being in war and going between war and peace that, people like me, journalists, and, people who just by default live in some of these places experience on a daily basis. So it just kind of all funneled into a fiction book where much of it is real from my own experiences, but also experiences of others, not just me.
Okay, thanks. Okay, there's a couple questions from audience members. Dalia, this one's for you. This is from Barbara Harrison. She wants to know if you've come across the name in your research of Hannibal Al-Khas, who's a painter.
I have not.
Okay.
Yes, he's well known.
Well-known painter, lived in California. This novel is similar to or different from the main character in Tehran at Twilight.
Persis, you were frozen for a minute, so I didn't catch the beginning of it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Fatima asks if the character in this novel is at all similar or different from the Tehran at Twilight protagonist.
There are definitely similarities, but they're very, very different. They're very different characters. And you would have to read the two books. Obviously, the reader the person has read Tehran at Twilight, it seems. They're very different. Their worldview is different, but also they share many of the same experiences because they have been in these wars.
Yeah. Maybe just a kind of point of current events, since Iran has been in the news over here the last 2 days. Trump's talking about an executive order that would punish arms trade with Iran. And then, of course, he was warning about, I guess there was some intelligence that Iran was planning a retaliation for Soleimani's death. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the temperature of the events in Iran right now towards Trump, for example, and also how your novels, both of you, how your novels really open up that conversation about Iran that is so absent most of the time because we're constantly just reacting. I mean, you talked about nuance, but in some ways you're asking your readers to think about Iran in a far more complicated way, and how that opens up this possibility for art to say something different. So if you could talk a little bit about current events, Salar maybe, and then both of you will, let's see, go ahead.
Iran, I've stated this in various articles in the past couple of years. This is a very difficult situation. The currency has really devalued. We've become poor. We've become a poor nation. We were not a poor nation. This was manufactured here in Washington and other places. and it's very hard for people. So they're very invested in the November elections in the United States, but people have different views about this in Iran itself also, not just Iranians here. You know, people support this side, they support that side. But the murder of General Haj Qasem Soleimani was really a watershed event. I was there when it happened, and the crowds who came out for his funeral in Tehran and other places, it was really monumental. It's not to be compared to anything except the state funeral for Imam Khomeini himself. And that said a lot of things to me about Iran, about what kind of a country it is, about the various, the dynamic that's going on in that country. And again, I come back like Dalia to the notion of nuance. Really, people have no idea how complicated this country of 80 million people is, and where their loyalties are very fluid, but not in the best sense of the term, not the worst sense of the term. They can come out for the state funeral of this man whom they think of as a hero, and then a few days later they come out in front of Polytechnic University, which is like a walk away from my place there, and then they hold demonstrations because mistakenly the Airbus was shot in retaliation. So right now in Iran, like always, there are all these different things going on, but ultimately it's about waiting out the next couple of months to see what happens. There's a lot at stake for Iran. Iran can withstand a lot. They learned to do it since the Iran-Iraq war, but it's really gotten to a pretty critical point, and everybody knows it.
Dalia, there's a question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. If you wanted to, this is from Neil Feldman. If you wanted to, could you say, if you wanted to, could you safely visit Iran with confidence you would return to the US as planned? Or would that be a bad idea for you as it is for so many others who might want to be, who the mullahs might want to imprison as a bargaining chip or blackmail?
Well, I mean, I don't know for sure. It's one of my great wishes to go back, and it's something I intend to do before I leave this earth. But I don't know. I think if I hadn't written anything, I think it would be perfectly fine, or most likely fine. You can never say perfectly fine with certain governments. But having written certain things, I don't know. And so I've been hesitant to try it, and I certainly don't want to try it with the current American administration and how things are at the moment. So I'm hoping that some other opportunity will open up.
Okay. There's a question here to both of you about, do you think your novels will be translated or could be translated into Persian at any point? And if not, why? And if yes, when?
They ask me often. I sort of whitewash my answer because of various reasons. But you know, the reality of Iran also is that there's censorship there, and you know, it's hard to work within an environment of, you know, I write past few years I've written articles. Many of my articles that get published here, they're published over there first. But but you know, over there, you always have to think about in the back of your head, you know, about well, will the censor, you know, and the censors are not like, you know, monsters lurking in the back. They're like people you would, you know, a lot of times, you know, you talk to them, you know, you know, they have their human beings, but that's their job for whatever reason, you know. So again, it's a complicated society, but at the end of the day, censorship is really for me, it's hard to, even though I write articles there, but even like when I put my article, the same article in Persian and then in English, obviously there are differences. You know, I had to change a word. I censored myself. That's a whole philosophical question that I wrestle with, like a lot of Iranian writers. So so a whole book, you know, that's a whole different animal, and I'm not ready for that just now.
Dalia?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Salar is much more immersed in the publishing landscape in Iran than certainly I am, but I don't think that my book would also withstand the censorship test, so I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, we need to wrap up. I'm getting the signal. So I want to thank both of you for your time, and Salar, especially you for joining us from Tehran. Their two books are here. I really encourage you to buy them. They're wonderful. Both of them are really riveting pieces of fiction, and they add an immense amount to our understanding about Iran and beyond that. And I hope that you will also support writers, because even though bookstores are sort of critically impacted by COVID, writers still write. They still need to make a living. So I hope you'll buy these books. And thank you both for your time and your wonderful novels.
Thank you, Persis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Dalia, Salar, Persis, thank you so much for that great discussion. And thanks all of you for joining us. If you missed any of tonight's discussion, or if you just want to watch it again, we'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel, so please look out for it there. And like Persis said, don't forget to purchase your copies of Man of My Time and Out of Mesopotamia in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great night. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.